The United States has before it the challenge, and this Congress can meet that challenge, for $1 billion of supplemental security assistance to replenish Israel's Iron Dome system. That funding is provided in H.R. 5323, the Iron Dome Supplemental Appropriations Act of 2022, passed by the House of Representatives by an overwhelming, and I emphasize overwhelming, bipartisan support. I want to thank my Connecticut colleague, Rosa DeLauro of New Haven, for her leadership, and all of the members of the House of Representatives for their vision and courage in separating this measure and passing it, and we should do so now as quickly as possible. All of us know that the 2016 Memorandum of Understanding negotiated between Israel and the United States provides $500 million per year in security assistance for Israel's missile defense. The MOU allows Israel to request additional funds to replenish and restore missile defense capabilities in exceptional circumstances. We all remember vividly the May 2021 conflict between Israel and Hamas, and in our minds, still vividly and graphically, are the pictures of that Iron Dome system intercepting missiles aimed at civilians in Israel. The Iron Dome defense system intercepted about 90% of those potentially lethal missiles targeting populated areas of Israel. In total, about 4,400 rockets were launched by Hamas. Should the Iron Dome have failed, countless Israeli civilians would have been killed. This system performed with such extraordinary and exceptional prowess, showing its necessity for both humanitarian and defensive purposes. I recently returned from a trip to Israel, where I talked to the top leadership of the new government, including the Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett. I was inspired and excited by the determination of the Israeli leadership, and I believe the Israeli people, to inaugurate a new era where we are even closer to Israel than we have been in the past. There have been some bumps in the road. There have been some potential disagreements in this body, but we should focus on making sure that Israel's defense is completely bipartisan, that our relationship with Israel crosses party lines. We have that opportunity today to renew the sense of bipartisanship in our unshakable relationship with Israel. And that relationship goes beyond just security concerns. We are bound by culture, heritage, faith, and a common commitment to democracy. And Israel has that commitment in perhaps the most constantly dangerous neighborhood in the world. Iron Dome is a defensive system. It is solely defensive. And it defends against the loss of civilians on both sides, in Gaza as well as Israel, because the loss of life in Israel, if it occurs, if Iron Dome is lacking, will lead to escalating violence that will cost lives in Gaza as well. The Iron Dome prevents escalating hostilities that will cost lives among both Palestinians and Israelis. And so its defensive value is indisputable. And that's why it does have bipartisan support here. It has the president's support. He stated, quote, "We're going to discuss Israel's unwavering commitment that we have in the United States to Israel's security, and I fully support replenishing Israel's Iron Dome system." A quote from his meeting prior to meeting with Prime Minister Bennett at the White House. Just 2 days before he made those remarks, Secretary Austin also expressed his support. Quote, "You can also see that commitment as we advocate for the replenishment of the Iron Dome missile defense system. The administration is committed to ensuring that Iron Dome can defend Israeli civilian population centers targeted by terrorist attacks, and we're working closely with Congress to provide all the necessary information to respond positively to your request for $1 billion in emergency funding, and it's going to save more innocent lives." I'm concerned that members of the United States Senate are blocking passage of this bill. Senator Paul has demanded that we add unrelated language to rescind funds from the Department of State and the Department of Defense before he will agree to a unanimous consent decree. We should prevent this sacred relationship from becoming a political football. We should make sure that we preserve it as a bipartisan source of consensus. And that is not to say necessarily that we agree with every single act, every single measure that our Israeli allies take. We can be friends and family and still disagree. But our aid should not be conditioned on agreeing with every single policy or action taken by our Israeli friends. This measure is a defensive platform that saves lives. It is a humanitarian step that should be regarded for what it is, essential to our alliance, our relationship, and our bond with Israel. Mr. President, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that at a time to be determined by the Majority Leader, following consultation with the Republican leader, the Senate proceed to consideration of calendar number 140, H.R. 5323, that there be up to 2 hours of debate, that upon the use or yielding back of time, the bill will be considered read a third time, and the Senate vote on passage of the bill without intervening action or debate.
Is there objection?
Mr. President,
Senator from Kentucky.
reserving the right to object, I agree with the senator from Connecticut that we should pass the proposal. In fact, I've offered a proposal to fund the Iron Dome with $1 billion, that it should be paid for, though. We're facing a $30 trillion debt. We borrow $2 million a minute. Inflation is rising. They're wanting to pile more debt upon our country. And so if we are going to help our ally Israel, I think we need to be strong to do it. We need to be not piling on debt without consequences, and this should be paid for. There's a very easy pay for that I proposed. There's $6 billion left in a reconstruction fund for the Afghan national government. Well, the Afghan national government no longer exists. In the haste to leave, the Biden administration has let the Taliban overrun the country. So I asked the other day in committee, I asked Secretary Blinken, this $6 billion, are you planning on giving it to the Taliban? And he says, well, it depends on whether they fulfill their commitments. To me, sounds like a pretty big if, but if the Biden administration says that they fulfill their commitment and expectations, the understanding is the Biden administration is going to give $6 billion to the Taliban. So not only did they let them take $80 billion of equipment, not only did we leave in complete disarray, Democrats now want to say, oh, we got to keep this money because we got to give it to the Taliban. That's obscene. We should immediately rescind all of that money. You want to give money to Afghanistan? Let's vote on it again. But you gave the money to the previous government, and now you want to give the money to the Taliban that's overrun the country. It's a disgrace. The Taliban shouldn't get a penny. And we should pay for things, even for things that we're trying to give to allies. So I have a proposal before the desk. My proposal says fully fund the $1 billion for the Iron Dome project. Fully fund it. We've already given billions for it, but we're willing to give $1 billion more, but we're going to pay for it by not giving money to the Taliban. It's a pretty easy sort of lift. We asked every senator on the Republican side if they objected to this. Not one Republican objected to this. So the reason Iron Dome is being held up is because Democrats are objecting to it being paid for. I'm here today to support the Iron Dome. I'm giving a proposal that would give them their $1 billion right now. It could happen today. All I ask is that it be paid for with money that's already been appropriated, that is in all likelihood going to be given to the Taliban if we don't take it away now. I think it's a very reasonable proposal. I'm disappointed that the Democrats are objecting to Iron Dome today. It is a disappointment that they're against paying for it with a fund that's already out there, that they so much love the idea of giving the money to the Taliban that they're going to insist on blocking Iron Dome funding because they're insistent on, no, we can't get rid of the $6 billion because if the Taliban behaves, we're going to give it to them. Look, I don't care if the Taliban behaves. I wouldn't give them a penny. There are other ways of trying to have a diplomatic relationship other than giving money to people. People think that somehow if the Taliban behaves, we got to give them money. I think that's a crazy notion. So without question, I will object. So I asked the senator to modify his request so that instead of his proposal, and as if in legislative session, the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of calendar item number 140, H.R. 5323. Further, that the only amendment in order to be my substitute amendment, which is at the desk. I further ask that there be 2 hours debate equally divided between the two leaders, and upon the use of yielding back at that time, the Paul substitute at the desk be considered and agreed to. The bill, as amended, be considered to read third time, and the Senate vote on passage of the bill as amended with no intervening action or debate.
Does the senator so modify his request?
Mr. President, reserving the right to object, let's set the record straight. There is no possibility of this money or any other money going to the Taliban. Section 9021 of the fiscal year 2021 Defense Appropriations Act, we all voted for it, makes funding the Taliban illegal. And if any Pentagon official breaks that law, they could go to jail under the Anti-Deficiency Act. Whatever the Secretary of the State may have answered to Senator Paul's question at a hearing, we should know, and he should know, that spending money in any way that enables it to go to the Taliban would be breaking the law. And he would have to come to Congress to use any of that money to aid the Taliban. So this is a false issue. The funds that the Paul Amendment seeks to rescind have actually not yet been appropriated. He targets the $3.3 billion in the fiscal year 2022 request. You can't rescind funds that haven't yet been appropriated. So the amendment falls of its own weight, but I want to deal with the merits. Number one, the Paul Amendment seeks to rescind funds from the Department of Defense's Afghan Security Forces Fund. Those funds are still needed to complete the withdrawal. They are in an account that is urgently needed to terminate contracts that are already in place and secure military equipment that has been withdrawn from Afghanistan. All the complaints about the withdrawal, all the complaints about the need to secure that military equipment, they are met by this funding. Defunding the Pentagon in this way will, in fact, disrupt the shutdown of these activities and open the United States to legal action from contractors. And I've been advised for those reasons that the Department of Defense strongly opposes the Paul amendments because it makes ending the war in Afghanistan more difficult. Let me just close by saying there is a need for humanitarian support in areas where the Palestinians live. There is a need for aid to water treatment and vaccines and health and all of the needs, humanitarian needs, of the Palestinian people. And one of the encouraging parts of my visit with the Israeli leadership was their recognition that Israel has a humanitarian obligation in this area. And they recognize as well that we may not always agree on every facet of our relationship, but this measure should be unconditional because it is defensive and it is humanitarian to support the Iron Dome. And I wish my Republican colleagues were here to refute Senator Paul, because I know many of them support it. So therefore, I will not modify my request.
Objection is heard. Is there objection to the original
Mr. President,
senator from Kentucky?
reserving the right to object, I'm disappointed that the Democrats will again today block the Iron Dome funding as paid for. I think it's important that we do support our allies. I'm in support of the Iron Dome funding, but I think at the very least it should be paid for. We've offered them various permutations of this, either the entire $6 billion from the Afghan Reconstruction Fund or $1 billion. We've offered them other alternatives to look at other funding in government that already exists to see if we could pay for this. So the real reluctance is on the Democrats' part to pay for our aid. And the thing is that we can't just blindly keep giving money away without repercussions. We're $30 trillion in debt. So I'm disappointed today that Democrats will block the Iron Dome funding as paid for, and I do object to the underlying proposition.
Heard.
Mr. President, by saying we need to pass this measure. We need to do it now. There is no need for pay for, and we should move ahead with this unanimous consent. I regret the objection, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
The senator from Nevada.
thank you. Mr. President, when I traveled to Israel in 2019, I saw with my own eyes the Iron Dome system, up close and in person. I met with the brave soldiers who operate and protect it, young men and women, in many cases no older than 18 or 19 years old. Iron Dome is a missile defense system that has successfully intercepted thousands of missiles fired by terrorist groups like Hamas at Israeli population centers. It has protected Jews, Christians, Muslims, protected them all from harm and saved countless lives, Israelis and Palestinians alike. This incredible feat of defense technology is a shining example of the unbreakable U.S.-Israel security partnership. The U.S. Army is in the process as well of acquiring Iron Dome batteries and tested the system as recently as August, meaning this life-saving technology could also protect American men and women in uniform from a variety of missile threats. Let me be clear. I want to emphasize the word defense. Iron Dome is a purely defensive system. It's a shield, a miraculous shield against death and destruction, one that America should be proud to help support and has supported across both Democratic and Republican administrations and in Democratic and Republican Congresses for over a decade. Iron Dome saves lives. Iron Dome prevents an escalation of violence, and Iron Dome provides a critical window for diplomacy. This past May, terrorist organizations launched over 4,400 rockets at Israel. That's right, 4,400 rockets. Iron Dome was key to preventing 90% of these rockets from reaching their targets, saving the lives of innocent Israeli citizens. We should be proud to support this technological feat that has protected countless lives and will continue to do so. My trip to Israel and my visit to see Iron Dome, well, it's on my mind today because Israel needs our help, and they need it now. This summer, following the barrage of rocket fire, those 4,400 missiles that Israel had to endure, and which the Iron Dome protected Israel against, Israel made an emergency request to the United States for security assistance in order to replenish and prepare the Iron Dome defense system to defend against future potential conflicts. To Israel's north, on the border with Lebanon, which I went to see just 2 years ago, Hezbollah, an Iranian-backed terrorist organization, is estimated to possess over 100,000 missiles. Those 100,000 missiles pointed at Israel, including thousands of precision missiles. If war were ever to break out again between Israel and Lebanon, as it did in 2006, Iron Dome would play a crucial role in protecting civilians, all civilians in Israel. Just a few months ago, I joined Democratic and Republican colleagues in urging continued support for Iron Dome. Support for Iron Dome is about the integrity of the U.S.-Israel relationship. There's always been strong bipartisan support for the U.S.-Israel defense partnership. That bipartisan support continues today. Failure to fund this critical defensive tool would be catastrophic for Israel and would result in lives lost. It would lead to more conflict, and it would weaken the bond between the United States and our greatest ally in the Middle East. We must take action to ensure that this program remains fully operational. The House of Representatives has already passed legislation in an overwhelmingly bipartisan basis to fund Iron Dome. It was a vote of 424 and only 9 against. So now it's the Senate's turn to act. Earlier this week, my colleague, Senator Menendez, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, said this, and I quote, "There is no conceivable reason why anyone in this chamber or on either side of the aisle should stand in the way of U.S. support for this life-saving defense to be fully ready for the next attack." He is exactly right. Opposition to Iron Dome is contrary to U.S. national security interests and violates the commitment that the U.S. government made to Israel. We have an opportunity to rebuild the Iron Dome shield, to support the security of our most important ally in the Middle East, and to save lives. But we must take action right here and right now. So, Mr. President, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that at a time to be determined by the majority leader, following consultation with the Republican leader, the Senate proceed to consideration of calendar number 140, H.R. 5323, that there be up to 2 hours for debate, that upon the use or yielding back of time, the bill be considered read a third time, and that the Senate vote on passage of the bill without intervening action or debate.
Is there objection?
Mr. President,
Senator from Kentucky.
reserving the right to object. As we speak, the Taliban is regaining control, has control over most of Afghanistan. They're brutalizing women, kicking women out of school. Women will no longer be participating in the government. It is really just unconscionable that Democrats insist that money be there to give to the Taliban. Any person who believes and truly believes that the Taliban is a menace to women's rights and to women in a civilized world should join me in saying we should make sure that no money ever goes to the Taliban. When Secretary Blinken was asked about this, He said that if there is cooperation and if they meet expectations, the $6 billion and some say up to $10 billion available for the previous government will be given to the Taliban, who violently overthrew this government. We were asking something very simple. We could fund Iron Dome today. Make sure that everybody who listens to this understands this is being blocked by Democrats who don't want to pay for it. We have a proposal that would have proposed $1 billion today for Iron Dome, but it would have been paid for by taking money out of an account that has been allocated and that Secretary Blinken has indicated he will give to the Taliban if they behave. So I think it's a real problem, and it's a problem of this body that the cavalier nature of just letting our country pile on $30 trillion of debt. You ask how we got here? We got here $1 billion at a time. So rarely do we have an episode or a time where we can object. You know, I would object to $1 trillion if it were on the floor. I would object to $50 billion on the floor. But the $1 billion ought to be paid for, and there's so many pay-fors. But this is why government grows by leaps and bounds and becomes more and more wasteful over time. So I do object.
Heard.
Mr. President,
Senator from Nevada.
Mr. Paul's objection is unacceptable. He knows it's unacceptable. This is no time for political games that could jeopardize the support for our allies and people in need of life-saving assistance. I challenge all my Republican colleagues to let us take up the House-passed bill, passed 420-9, and fund Iron Dome for our national security, as well as Israel's. I yield.